Good evening, everybody. My name is Sarah Ali. I'm the president of Students for Justice in Palestine here at Brooklyn College. Before we start, we have Professor Barbara Winslow here. She'd like to read a statement on behalf of the Shirley Chisholm Project.
Good evening, everybody. I'm so glad to see you all here. I'm Barbara Winslow. I'm the director of the Shirley Chisholm, I have a loud voice, director of the Shirley Chisholm Project of Brooklyn Women's Activism. And we are one of the group that has endorsed this event. And we're endorsing this event for many reasons. One, today is Shirley Chisholm Day at Brooklyn College. And this morning we had a room full of students and faculty to discuss not only Shirley Chisholm's legacy, but the importance of what's going on in Ferguson, what it means to us in Brooklyn and throughout the world. Shirley Chisholm, I think, would have been very supportive of this event. She was, one, a college professor, both at Mount Holyoke and at Spelman, and believed in justice for teachers. Two, she was a supporter of the Palestinian struggle. And to give you an idea of what a fierce, courageous, and gutsy woman this woman was, when she was campaigning for the presidency in 1972, she was in Miami and asked questions about where she stood on the Israeli-Arab question, and she said she stood with the Palestinians. Now, this is in 1972 and in Miami, of all places. She wasn't afraid, and she supported the Palestinian struggle because she believed in justice. Now, my other hat is I'm a professor in the Women and Gender Studies program here at Brooklyn College, and I am very proud to say, and I'm here with my colleague and friend and sister and comrade and compañera, Roz Pacheski, that at our National Women's Studies Association conference, we enthusiastically formed a group, Feminists for Justice in Palestine, and the undersigned members of the National Women's Studies Association endorsed the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions issued by a broad coalition of Palestinian civil society in 2005. As feminist scholars, activists, teachers, and engaged intellectuals, we recognize the interconnectedness of the systemic forms of oppression, including genocide, slavery, racism, sexism, homophobia, class-based oppression, Islamophobia, ableism, ageism, and more, and the transformative potential of resistance and solidarity in all our communities, as well as across divides and borders. I don't want to read the whole resolution because it's very long, but I just want to say how honored I am to be able to say a few words and to congratulate Brooklyn College and the Students for Justice for holding this meeting. And welcome to Brooklyn College, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Okay, so I'm just going to give a brief introduction of the panel tonight. We have Professor Stephen Salaita. He's an associate professor of English at Virginia Tech. He is the author of 6 books and writes frequently about Arab Americans, Palestine, indigenous peoples, and decolonization. His current book project is entitled Images of Arabs and Muslims in the Age of Obama. We also have Professor Catherine Frank tonight. She is the Isidore and Seville Sulzbacher Professor of Law at Columbia University, and she directs the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law. And here to moderate the discussion tonight, we have Professor Corey Robin from the Political Science Department here at Brooklyn College. And without any further ado, Corey, you can take over.
Welcome, everybody. So, can you all hear me? We promised you a conversation, and we are going to have a conversation. We're not going to have formal presentations. We're just going to first have a discussion with our 2 guests, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So that's how it's going to go. So I wanted to really start by asking Stephen, just to introduce yourself to Brooklyn College, who you are, where you're from, your family, and where you went to school, and what you studied, and how you came to the interests that you have.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Okay, thank you. First, let me thank SJP for working so hard to put together this fantastic event, and to Corey for to Corey for his organizational work on it and agreeing to moderate. And really quickly, very quickly, while I'm sharing a table with them, I want to thank both publicly thank both Catherine and Corey. When they found out that I got fired, they understood immediately that it wasn't just about me, but about broader issues of academic freedom and faculty governance and the repression of Palestinian voices in academia and elsewhere. But even while they recognized those things and organized around those things, they offered me personal support and friendship, and I think that a sharp intellect and empathy make for an unstoppable combination. So, well, I was born in Appalachia, in a little town called Bluefield, to immigrant parents. My dad is from Jordan. He's what they would call a Jordanian, meaning a Jordanian not of Palestinian origin, and my mother is of Palestinian origin, but she was born and raised in Nicaragua. And so I have something of an unusual background, and I've been working for many years on ethnic literature, indigenous studies, American Indian studies. This is sort of the broad cross section of disciplines where my work is located, and I think what brings me here to this particular spot in this particular moment in time is that I've recently become the subject of a decent amount of conversation because in early August the University of Illinois terminated a contract for me to join the faculty in less than a month as a tenured professor of American Indian Studies.
Okay. So, as you said, you study. I think one of the things that I've come to learn is a field of what's called comparative indigeneity. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about I think people know you more at this point because of the case, but if you could talk a little bit about your intellectual interests, your academic work, what is that field, and what led you to think about Native Americans and Palestinians in a comparative light, and what you think we gain by putting those, making that comparison. Okay. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure, of course. I've always been interested in Palestine. That was kind of a topic of conversation in my household growing up, and I didn't really develop any awareness of issues in American Indian nations until I took a course in college in the Native American novel. And one of the first things I realized when I took that course is that it was absolutely shameful that I had gone more than 20 years in the United States without a sense of indigenous peoples on the continent existing in contemporaneous spaces rather than as artifacts or relics trapped in the past and imagined as a sort of token of American modernity, and there was no sense that these communities were still living, still fighting for justice, still fighting for sovereignty, still fighting for the decolonization of their lands, weren't interested in the traditional forms of assimilation, the process by which we often are made to recognize the needs of ethnic minority communities. I didn't know that they don't generally consider themselves to be ethnic minority communities in the first place, that they consider themselves quite rightly to be nations, right? Nations with their own national histories and their own national aspirations, and very few Americans know these things, right? It tells you how the the understanding of race and ethnicity in this country often gets limited to liberal discourses of multicultural belonging, and doesn't talk about race and dispossession as structural factors, right? In the fabric of American history. And so I recognized in a lot of these questions about Native dispossession, Palestine. I recognized Palestine all over the place, and I recognized Palestine in two ways. One, I recognized some comparable conditions in the process of New World settlement, right, with the settlement of Palestine by Zionists starting in the late 19th century. But I also noticed Palestine as a symbol or an avatar, right, of the mentality or the imagination of many of the early American settlers, particularly the Puritans in the Northeast. Their conceptualization of themselves as Israel in the wilderness, fighting against fighting against an Amalek that God wants them to either convert or slaughter, right? And so they were really recapitulating some of the stories of the book of Joshua. And Cotton Mather's famous phrase is that we have to rid ourselves of this blight that is annoying this Israel in the wilderness. All right, so the land, right, in the eyes of the settler, takes on this biblical connotation and biblical performance. And so ever since then, I've been looking at the ways that these certain discourses of settlement have traveled back and forth across the Atlantic at different points in history.
So, a quick question or follow-up on that, which is, when your case kind of exploded, it seemed very hard for people to understand, what is the connection? You're in an American Indian Studies department, but he talks about Palestine. What is he? And there was this constant refusal to even consider what you just said, to even think about that. And I wonder if that's something you encounter a lot, or have encountered a lot, and what is that about? Why don't people want to think about these two stories, these two realities, in comparative perspective?
Okay, I think it depends a lot on the politics of the speaker. I think a lot of folks don't want to think about Israel or the United States as colonial projects, right? I think that's the first problem. But even beyond that, there was this move to support the university's administration by focusing on these made up procedural issues, such as this guy is not, he works on Palestine, therefore he's not qualified to teach in American Indian Studies, which is a remarkably dishonest claim to make, because these are folks who weren't on the search committee, right? It wasn't their choice to make, right? I don't even know why the hell I got hired. I submitted an application. I went through the process. They offered me a job. I accepted it. We signed a contract. The end, right? I wasn't sitting there with them when they were making their deliberations. And so, everybody behind a keyboard has become an expert on the hiring process to which none of them has been privy, and all of a sudden they become experts in American Indian Studies, right? But that's the thing, though, right? See, it's not an accident, right? Because there's a kind of a majoritarian sensibility that is quick to render itself, right, experts, right, on the lives and histories of Native Americans, right? They're ultimately in control of a certain paradigm around what it means, right, to be Indian in the modern world, if the Indian has even made it into the modern world in the first place. They're arbiters of Indian identity, or they appropriate Indian identity, or I should say, to be more precise, an invented Indian identity, right? To stake some sort of psychic connection to the land that they've colonized and that they yearn so deeply to become a part of, right? And so they, that's the first thing, right? The profound dishonesty that goes into these questions about qualifications. But second of all, people don't appear to have much of an idea of the way that the question of Palestine has in fact been taken up in recent years by American Indian and indigenous studies, right? It's been taken up for some of the reasons that I've mentioned, but also because of a growing recognition of the role that Israel has traditionally played as a colonizing force, not in Palestine, right, but in other parts of the world, particularly Central America, right? The role that Israel has played in training and funding death squads in Guatemala, right? Read about Israel and El Generalissimo Rios Montt, right? Read about Israel's relationship to the to the Contras. Read about Israel's relationship to the Salvadoran death squads, right? So there's sort of a growing understanding that when we think of the United States as a colonial presence, that we ought to think about Israel, right, as a corresponding presence that it's very difficult to separate into a distinctive category from the U.S.
So I want to move us a little bit now towards the situation at the University of Illinois, and I want us to bring us back to during the summer, and the Gaza war is going on, and I just want you to kind of recreate for us, if you can, what was going on for you, and what were you thinking about as that was happening? Did this just seem more of the same to you? Just yeah.
I mean, there was a pretty profound sense of anguish and horror that I feel like I shared in common with a lot of people, right, online and offline, and a sense that there's nothing useful that we can do, to prevent the sort of abject suffering that the people of Gaza were enduring. The images were coming across our social media feeds of dead infants and toddlers. I kept seeing images of children being stored in an ice cream freezer because the morgues had run out of space, right? And there was no electricity anyway, right? So the bodies were going to decompose rapidly in the summer's heat. It's, and a sense not only of helplessness, but outrage at the way this slaughter was being covered in corporate media, right? They keep focusing on reprisals and rockets and reprisals and rockets and who fired a rocket first. I don't give a damn who fired first. The point is, Israel displaced 700,000 people in 1948. That's what happened first. All right, that's what started it. And this complete lack of understanding of this very basic context of colonialism and the fact that the people of Gaza have been entrapped and confined and Israel's been mowing the lawn and putting them on a diet and doing all kinds of other horrible things to them for years, and then corporate media sort of treats it with this sense of equivalence, right? Like Hamas and Israel exchanged fire, it's as if there's some plane of equality on which the two entities exist, and no understanding of the colonial framework, and no understanding. And this is a problem with a lot of corporate media vis-a-vis any site of conflict in which there's in which there's disparate power among the participants. You see it in Ferguson, you see it in all kinds of places. But they talk about violence as if violence is something that happens in self-contained moments or events, right? That can be identified and categorized. But for the people of Gaza, they endure continual violence, right? Everything about the conditions in which they live is violent. Everything about the military occupation of the West Bank is violent. And it's a constant violence, and it's not a violence you step off of the street from and shield yourself from and don't have to deal with anymore. So all of these things are on my mind, and this is Twitter, whatever its problems, it can also be a way of articulating viewpoints and being in conversation with like-minded people. But it's also an appeal too. When something horrible is happening, it's an appeal that somebody out there with some semblance of power do something to make this horrible thing stop.
So I want to ask you something that's I think it's on people's minds, and I feel like I have to, and I just want to read out some of the tweets.
Sure.
And ask you to talk a little bit about them. So, and this is sort of a cross section over a period of weeks and days. So, first one, let's cut to the chase. If you're defending Israel right now, you're an awful human being. Second one, if it's anti-Semitic to deplore colonization, land theft, and child murder, then what choice does any person of conscience have? 3, you may be too refined to say it, but I'm not. I wish all the West Bank settlers would go missing. 4th, Zionists, transforming anti-Semitism from something horrible into something honorable since 1948. And then last, I refuse to conceptualize Israel-Palestine as Jewish-Arab acrimony. I'm in solidarity with many Jews and in disagreement with many Arabs.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I'll start with the last one. It's a simple enough statement in philosophical and moral opposition to ethno-nationalism, that we shouldn't choose our politics based on filiation or affiliation, that there ought to be different sets of factors that play into our thinking and that might influence the direction in which we move. The other, I feel like the second tweet about Zionists transforming anti-Semitism, and the fourth tweet, if it's anti-Semitic to deplore colonization, land theft, and sort of go into one another. And see, Twitter conversations happen in I guess specific moments of time that come out of broader conversations. And so I was criticizing Israel, and people are like filling up my mentions with accusations that I'm being anti-Semitic, right? And so those tweets are sort of response to it, and it's asking people quite simply to examine the discourse they're using and to think it through. Now look, I'm not asking or expecting folks to agree with me. There are people in this room. There are people on this, behind this table who know a lot more about the history of anti-Semitism than I do. But I know enough about, closely examining a discourse, right, to know that conceptualizing criticism of the behavior of a nation state as anti-Semitism is not only a stupid thing to do, but it alters, at least tacitly, the meaning of anti-Semitism, right? And it ends up devaluing, the actual instances of anti-Semitism that still happen across the United States and all over the world. To me, it's I would say that as a non-Jew, maybe it's not my place to comment on how Jewish folks should should conceptualize and define notions of anti-Semitism. But as an Arab who is constantly being called anti-Semitic, it becomes my problem too, and it becomes a problem of all the Palestinians, right? Because it's my sense that Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim Americans, tend actually to be extremely careful about making distinctions between Jews and Zionists and Jews and the state of Israel, because they've spent so much time being implicated, right, as an entire group, right, for the acts of violence that other people do, so Boko Haram does something, and all of a sudden all Muslims in the United States are implicated. We know that feeling, right? We know that it's not a good idea to implicate an entire cultural group, right, into a political, or to conflate it with a political action, right, or form of violence. And so I see it as deeply problematic that some supporters of Israel are invoking this particular rhetorical technique to shut down some of the much needed criticism of Israel, and that to cast Israel as the embodiment of Jewish values or of the Jewish people is ludicrous at a basic empirical level. It completely erases, right, the huge number of Jews who are not Zionist, right, or who don't have any identification with the state of Israel one way or the other, who just don't give a damn, right, and it also places this kind of onus on Israel, right, to be perceived in an exceptional manner as something godly and timeless, that Zionists then disavow, right, when Israel is criticized by saying, well, why don't you focus on China, or North Korea? It's like, well, you're the one who told us that it's special. You're the one who told us it's better than everything else. You're the one who told us it's godly, all right? You're the one who made the place exceptional, right? So don't complain when we point out to you that the only exceptional thing about it from the point of view of Palestinians is the amount of killing it can do, right, while being completely absolved by the government of its main sponsor, the United States. Right? That's what we see as exceptional in Israel, right? It's certainly not a moral exceptionalist. I'm rambling. I don't even know what the original question was. Sorry. Oh, describing the tweets. So just one last quick one. About the one you may be refined to say, but I'm not. I wish all the West Bank settlers would go missing. Let me just say, you don't have to believe me, all right? You don't have to buy my explanation. I understand, but you cannot justify firing me based on an inference about what somebody means in a tweet. All right. The first thing that I teach students, I have one here. She can form one. She can vouch for it. That authorial intent is not a good way to interpret a novel. All right. Or a tweet in this case. So, well, he meant that he wanted them murdered or he wanted them kidnapped. No, I didn't mean that. Actually, I meant that I want them to go missing. Am I a shrinking violet on Twitter? I'm not passive aggressive. If I would have wanted them murdered or kidnapped, I would have said murdered or kidnapped, right? And when I say go missing, I wish you got to understand that there's a long tradition of people who've been colonized wishing that their colonizers would go away. You might not like to hear it, but it's true. They don't like you. They don't want you there. Please read The Wretched of the Earth and read what Frantz Fanon has to say about what the native says about the settler. All right? That comes directly out of that framework. Think about the ghost dance in the 1890s, in the lead up to the Wounded Knee massacre, right? the ghost dance was an articulation of the desire that all the settlers go away, right? And I don't like to totalize based on ethnicity, because I'm sure there are plenty of Palestinians and Arab Americans who disagree heartily with much of what I say, but I can't help but point out all the feedback that I've received over the past 3 months about everything, right? I've been receiving a lot of feedback. See how civil and diplomatic I can be. Not a single damn Palestinian or person of color has complained about that tweet. Not a single one. Right? Not a single one. It seems to be oriented in a discursive community or political community where the very thought of not accepting the presence, right, or the power of the colonizer is a sort of personal rejection that they simply cannot tolerate. But it's one that if we're going to understand the situation clearly, right, we need to confront. The Palestinians do not want Israeli settlers on the West Bank, and we want them to go away. All right? That's what that tweet was saying, and I can understand why people reacted strongly to it, but it's a sentiment that you will find on every single street corner, on every single village or city on the West Bank.
So I want to move away from you and your case and to try to get us to talk now, and I want to bring Catherine and both of you, but since Catherine has not been part of this so far, to contextualize this. What is happening with academic freedom around the country? Firstly, on the issue of Israel-Palestine. Let's start with that, but I think we want to move out from there. But let's start with that, if you want to take a crack.
Oh, what is happening with academic freedom? I think there are a couple ways to think about it. One is that we could talk specifically about the discussion of Israel-Palestine and campuses. And secondly, we can talk about how the way that universities are dealing with the perceived controversy of talking about Israel-Palestine in the way we are here is a wedge for diminishing rich academic culture and robust and sometimes uncomfortable conversations in universities more generally. And it's part of a larger corporatization of the university, I think, that wants to banish from its life, intellectual life, discussion of issues that might offend funders of the university. So we can open up the optic very broadly, or we could keep it quite specific. And I think in both instances, there's a lot to say. So Stephen's case is important in its own terms, but it's not unique. He and I got to know each other over the summer when I knew of your work, but I didn't know you before August 1st, or 2nd, I guess it was. And a lot of attention has been given to his case, but he will be the first to admit that he is not alone in suffering of kind of retaliation, punishment, backlash, censorship, or a range of things for having a particular perspective on the question of Israel's legitimate occupation of the West Bank, or the complex issues of belonging, dispossession, and justice in the space that is Israel-Palestine. It's hard to think of another topic that we talk about in the academy that generates this degree of heat, and where the claim is made that you cannot say certain things. We're committed as academics and as students to thinking hard about hard things. And it so violates the very idea of the university to say that that we might even talk critically about a state, not about Jews, but about a state and the actions of a state. And we might think critically about the claims of belonging and dispossession of people who've been displaced by a state and suffer violence daily by that state. That somehow that is out of bounds. in every instance. So even the media that was circulating the last few days about this event seemed to already know what we were going to say. I didn't know what we were going to say, and had prejudged it, that it was out of bounds. This is not the kind of conversation you can have in a university. And that is just wrong. It is just wrong. We can disagree. I'm sure there are people in this audience who disagree with some of the things that Stephen has said, and I haven't spoken long enough for you to disagree with things that I say, but I'm hoping that you'll disagree with some of them. But that's what we do in the academy. We teach each other when we disagree. And we don't just pound the table. We make arguments. And we produce evidence. And we speak from a position of rigor, not from a position of ideology that needs not make an argument in its name. And so that's what's so frustrating and so horrifying about what's happened in Stephen's case, but not only his. I've suffered much less violent and situations of censorship in my own campus. At Columbia, I often refer to Columbia Law School as Hebrew University on the Hudson. We have an extremely close relationship with Hebrew U and with many of the universities in Israel. We have faculty and students exchanged constantly. And you don't hear Columbia Law School being criticized for only taking one side of the issue of Israel-Palestine. And often the people who come to the law school have very strong views on the justice of the Israeli state. But we don't get criticized for having people who have a particular viewpoint and make arguments about it. It's only when you have a viewpoint that's more like Stephen's that you're seen as biased. So how does bias surface? What are the circumstances in which bias surfaces? And rather than reasoned scholarship, careful scholarship, that makes a particular argument that makes some people uncomfortable. So that's the beginning of an answer about what this is all about.
I want to get Stephen in on this, but I did want to inject something that just this week at Brooklyn College, and some of you know this, we had another speaker, Katha Pollitt, was here speaking on abortion rights. And whereas whenever the issue of Israel-Palestine comes up, there's the question that you just said of bias. You have to have both sides. It's always the first thing. You have to have both sides. And it was brought up by certain departments and certain faculty and administrators for tonight. Katha Pollitt came, spoke by herself, and the title of her talk, which was about defending abortion rights, was pro. Defending abortion rights. Pro. Not pro and con, not let's consider, but just pro. And nobody said anything about it. It was just completely normal. And, what strikes me about this is, if we were in a state like Mississippi or Alabama where you can be sure the issue of abortion is far more contested. I mean, frankly, it's contested on our campus. I mean, many of our students are not necessarily in favor of reproductive rights. So, it is fascinating to me, just it's the way this tag appears on that issue. But anyway, I just jumping in, but
Oh no, I really don't have much to add to what you and Catherine said. I was at Princeton a few days ago, and there was an article in the foreword about their recent move to do divestment, and one of the faculty members at Princeton is the former U.S. ambassador to Israel. I can't remember his name.
Kurtzer.
Michael Oren.
Dan Kurtzer.
Dan Kurtzer,
Yeah.
exactly. And he had a wonderful quote in that article after 3 paragraphs of disparaging the divestment resolution. He says that I just don't think it's productive to take sides at this moment. You see, and that could only happen in the context of one geography automatically being conferred the status of civil, right? And another geography automatically being conferred the status of savage or barbaric or backwards, right? That, see, when you take the side of the state or when you take the side of state power, you're not taking a side. You're defaulting to the norm. It's when you take the side of anything in opposition to state power that you're taking sides. That's when you become biased, right? That's when you become non-objective, or whatever other platitude that they pull out. So you can take Israel's side and then proclaim that you haven't taken a side at all, based on a certain sort of logic that taking Israel's side is the natural and normal thing to do, right? And I think these phenomena sort of speak to that, right? And as to the idea of pro and con and balance, that there's always a sense that a pro-Palestine speaker, right, needs a pro-Israel speaker alongside her or alongside him for the sake of balance. That ain't balance. That's oversight, right? That's oversight. They don't want a pro-Israel speaker alongside him, right, or alongside her. They want a pro-Israel speaker there to invalidate him and to make sure that he doesn't get a little too excitable or out of hand in his condemnations of Israel. There's got to be somebody there to snip around the perimeters and make sure that things don't get too uncivil.
I want to ask you a little bit. You've used the language of civility, and I want to get to that in a minute. But I wonder though if you could both of you think about. It seems like there's just impressionistically, there's more and more of these cases that are cropping up in the last couple of years. So A, I don't know if that's true or not. So if you could speak to that, and B, if it is true, why? Why more of these academic freedom cases around this issue now as opposed to 90s or the 2000s or whatever we call that? So.
There are an enormous number of cases, not exactly like Stephen's, but this afternoon I was emailing with a faculty member at a Northeast college in the Northeast who is pretty sure she's not going to get tenure. She's of Palestinian descent because she invited a speaker. She was the co-sponsor with SJP of a speaker who offered views that were critical of the state of Israel and of the occupation. And because of that, she was a junior faculty member, didn't speak at the event, just attended it and facilitated the invitation. Her tenure committee has decided not to recommend her for tenure because she's creating a hostile environment for students in the college in which she teaches. Other faculty have been denied research grants for work that they do in Israel-Palestine if those projects are not ones that have a particularly positively pro-Zionist agenda embedded in them. And when they come back from that work, the research for which they said that they were going to promise to do while they were there is very closely examined to make sure that the work actually conformed to what the research proposal embodied. And I can tell you almost always when you start research, it ends up being quite different from what you thought you'd get into. You don't know what you're going to find. And you would be doing a bad job as a researcher, when whatever field you were, if you just stuck to whatever your hypothesis was before you started the work. But in this particular area, there's a kind of gotcha way in which universities are trying to catch people in technical violations of not doing the work they promised to do because their research took them elsewhere, at which point they have to reimburse the university and pay a fine for their research. Just on the sort of mundane level, when I returned from the West Bank a couple of years ago, I wanted to do a talk at the law school about the work I was doing with women lawyers in Ramallah. And the title of the talk was The View from Palestine, Women Lawyers, and something like that. And I was told by the dean's office, you can't have an event with the word Palestine in it because there's no such thing as Palestine. And I thought, well, Tibet, I mean, we could start with a list of places. Even if you agreed that there's no such thing as Palestine, or that as a political concept it's in play, we have events all the time around real and imagined states. But why would that matter? So I went ahead and had the event anyway. And then a number of us have to have security, university security, at our offices because we've endorsed the cultural and academic boycott. Shortly after I did a few years ago, people actually showed up at my office to yell at me.
Yeesh.
Never mind email and the other ways in which I've been attacked. And that's not something I'm doing as part of my academic work. It's something I'm doing as a person. But I can give you countless examples of faculty who've been punished for expressing views, doing research, helping out students, even inviting someone to speak at their college, because those views challenge a particular view of political Zionism. Why is this happening more? Partly, I think, because the BDS movement is gaining steam, and I think people are worried about that. We're seeing a larger, certainly far less than a consensus, but a larger body of people internationally who are kind of questioning the legitimacy of the occupation and thinking hard about the rightness of the claims of Palestinians in response to the violence and occupation they suffer. And because of that, there's been a very well-financed, very well-organized movement to punish academics who speak on this issue. There are projects funded in Boston, in California, and around the country whose only mission is to censor speech critical of Israel on campuses. It says it in their mission statements. And they're well-funded. They have campus outposts of students whose job this is to come to lectures like this, record them, and then punish us later for it. I teach classes where I have plants in every one of my classes who want to know what I'm saying. All of our events are monitored by these groups. It feels a little like the 50s in a way of being monitored for what you say because you know you will pay a price for it. But it's not accidental that this stuff is coming up now in the way it is. There's a very well-organized movement and institutions and organizations that is their job, to make trouble for those of us who speak in ways that are critical of a certain form of political Zionism.
I agree with what Catherine has said. We could probably think of lots of legitimate reasons why these acts of oppression, or repression, appear to be on the rise. One of the most interesting of those reasons, to me, builds off what Catherine is saying. I believe that it's becoming increasingly difficult to defend Israel, and as it becomes more and more difficult to defend Israel, it becomes more necessary to shut the criticism down altogether, or not even have the debate or the conversation or the discussion in the first place. And I think back to the discourse around the ASA boycott debate, and that went on for a while. And there were really a lot of people, sharing their opinions on that matter, throwing their hat into the debate. And it struck me after a while that we were no longer arguing about whether Israel does bad things. We were arguing about whether academic boycott, is an appropriate response to those bad things, right? And we were arguing about academic freedom as an abstract principle and whether it's ever justified, right? So people against the boycott weren't saying, what you're saying about Israel is ludicrous and completely untrue and unfounded. They were just saying, well, other countries are shitty too. Other countries are violent too. Other places do bad things, or we're against boycott on principle. And while you're at it, quit singling out Israel, right? And then they were really, they were basically, I don't know, it was a weird moment, but the argument was largely, we oppose academic boycotts. So why don't you go and boycott North Korean universities? That was kind of the argument. And then even in Operation Protective Edge, I saw the same phenomenon play out in rationalizations for Israel's behavior, right? No, very few people were denying that Israel was killing people by the dozen or by the hundred. Nobody was denying that Israel was killing babies and children by the hundred. Nobody was denying that Israel was blowing up hospitals and UN shelters and schools, right? Or very few people were denying these things. They were simply blaming it on the Palestinians. They're saying it's the Palestinians' fault. You know, Hamas specifically, it's Hamas's fault, or the Palestinians are making us do it, right? Which is a reboot of a very, very, very old colonial idea that the heart of the colonizer was innocent and pure until he encountered the native, at which point he became corrupt, right? And he was forced into acts of violence against his better disposition, right? Hell, that's the entire thesis of like Munich. You know, the Steven Spielberg film, right? Like, we Jews were such a innocent people, right? And until we had to deal with these Palestinians, and now they're making us do all kinds of horrible things to them, and my soul is anguished as a result, right? And so it's a reboot of a very old idea of the native having a corrupting influence on the inherent goodness of the colonizer. But again, there's no denial of the war crimes, right? There is an argument about who is responsible for the war crimes. So again, it seems to me that the arguments change, and it's very difficult to defend Israel on the grounds of policy, right? Or even on the grounds of ideology, as the Israeli government moves further and further to the right. Right, and people like Lieberman, right, keep spouting off more and more insanely racist propositions. So I think that in part, right, I think there are a lot of reasons for the increase, but one of them to me is it seems to me that instead of defending Israel, a lot of people would just rather not hear criticism of Israel in the first place.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to just ask one more question, and then we're going to open up to the audience. But I'm going to do a two-parter to try to get as much in as I can. But I'm going to ask both of you to try to be brief as possible. It's Catherine, you earlier when you talked about academic freedom, you said this is what we do in academia. We present arguments with rigor and evidence. And I think one of the issues that came up, and the counter that I had says, that's fine. But if that's what we're protecting, why should we protect tweets? Why should we protect what a faculty person is doing on Twitter, which is not necessarily about rigor and evidence, but something else? So I wanted to ask you, why should academic freedom, both of you, include these kind of extramural statements? Why should it? Why shouldn't it protect this? But that if you're going to do that, forget it. So that's the first part, and the second part is related to this, which is this civility issue, which has come up a lot. And you joked earlier, Stephen. You said, "See, I can be civil." So why shouldn't we be? If you can be civil, why shouldn't we always be civil? Why shouldn't we be civil? What's so wrong about civility?
Okay.
So, and then we'll open it up to everybody.
Well, thank you so much for that question. I'm being civil.
You did it very well.
I'm from the Midwest, and we're nice to people there. We don't say mean things to their face the way New Yorkers do. We just wait till they leave the room. And then we're kind of sarcastic. So those are big questions, and I don't know how to be so brief, but I will be brief because I'm really curious to hear what the rest of you in this community feel about these issues. But civility was the charge against Stephen that the chancellor relied on in saying I'm not going to take your appointment to the board of trustees because what you said in your tweets was problematic, not in its substance, but in its tone. And it created, they believed, a hostile learning environment for certain students at the University of Illinois and rendered you unsuitable as a professor by virtue of your temperament, not your ideas. So one question is, in what role was he tweeting? Once a professor, always a professor? Do we not enjoy a private identity or an identity that is larger than our role as a professor? That's one set of questions we might ask. When we are our sexual selves, when we are our political selves, when we are our religious selves, when we're praying, are we doing so as professors? And does what we do in those contexts cast a shadow on our classroom identities? I think not. So I do think, I don't want to invoke a public-private distinction because feminists have done a very good job, I believe, of taking that distinction apart. But I do want to encourage us to think critically about what we're doing when we're tweeting. If I'm in class tweeting about the class, okay. But I don't think you were acting as a professor in your own mind when you were tweeting. And at the same time, I do think, by virtue of our privilege of being faculty, it enables us to do certain things politically outside the classroom. So there is a porous relationship between these roles as private citizen, as person engaged in a set of hard political questions, and as a professor. And I don't think there's a clear answer to that question. But the civility one is easy. Civility, and I've said this elsewhere, and I've said it more uncivilly, is not an academic norm. If we purge from the university outrage, anger, I get angry in my classes. My students get angry. They read a book that I give them that I don't agree with, but I'm giving it to them in order to provoke them. And then we talk about it. That's what we do in universities. So to say that the only holding environment for learning is one that is constructed around a norm of civility grossly misstates what it means to think hard about hard things. And if we're not generating emotional reactions to the things we're thinking about that might sometimes be understood as uncivil, then there's something wrong. We've thinned out the educational enterprise. And I do want to just mention one, I have so many things to say about civility, but I just want to say one local thing. And I'm curious, is this diverse viewpoint statement, is it something that's always read before student events? Yeah. It is? Okay. So that's interesting, because part of what it said was that being tolerant of diverse viewpoints and the sort of values that it was invoking were important for career success. And I think part of the civility norm is about training students to be certain kinds of citizens who don't make trouble later, and certain types of workers who don't take on management or don't take on authority in the workplace. So learning how to encounter things that upset you and respond in a civil way relates to your career success in ways that I find very troubling. So, the university is a space that should be thought of not as an extension of our childhoods, or your childhoods, you students, and I think the turn to trigger warnings and civility and some of what we're talking about tonight, in a way imagines the students in college and in graduate school as sort of in an elongated childhood for which we are their parents in a way, taking care of them and learning how to teaching them not to bite and hit one another and things like that. But the alternative thought that's at work here around the university is that it is training for a career, most importantly. That's new. That we're training you for a particular form of market activity later. It used to be that this was the place where you did stuff that didn't necessarily cash out later, but that enriched you as a person who will go on to do who knows what. I never thought I would be a law professor, right? My younger me would have been horrified at the thought of it, of me working at Columbia Law School. Just a horrible sellout, bourgeois, terrible thing to do. But here I am, right? And the things I learned in college prepared me for a very complicated adult life that is in no way over, and who knows where it will go. So to reduce the college experience to career training and professionalism drains the richness of a college or university education, of the richness of thinking ideas and learning about unsolvable problems in complicated ways that we do in English departments and in law schools too. And so I would just ask that even if you do care about diversity of viewpoints, which I think we should, not because it's an instrumental value to getting a job later, but because it opens you up to something that may challenge what you believe is already settled in your own heart and mind.
I have nothing useful to add to that.